The supervisor's voice cut across the emergency bay like a blade meant to draw blood in public. Security. Nurse Director Patricia Voss pointed one manicured finger at the woman standing near the entrance doors. Remove her. Now. Amara Belrose had not moved, had not spoken, had simply walked through the same doors she'd walked through for 6 years, wearing scrubs she'd borrowed from a shelter donation bin, carrying a canvas bag pressed flat against her ribs like it contained something worth dying for. Because it did. Patricia stepped closer, close enough that Amara could smell her perfume, the same expensive kind she used to notice from the nurse's station, back when Amara still had a nurse's station. You have no business being here, Patricia said, loud, deliberate, making sure the orderlies heard, making sure the patients waiting in plastic chairs heard, making sure every former colleague who'd paused their morning routine to watch this unfold heard every syllable. You're not a nurse anymore, you're a thief, and you're embarrassing yourself. Someone laughed, not quietly. Amara recognized the voice without turning to look. Marcus Webb, surgical prep tech, 3rd year. She'd covered his shift twice when his mother was sick. She'd stayed 4 extra hours both times without complaint. She kept her eyes on Patricia's face and did not move. If you have ever been stripped of everything you earned and then forced to stand in the wreckage of it, while people who know the truth say nothing, then you already understand what the next 30 seconds cost her. If you haven't, pay attention. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will change how you see power, loyalty, and who deserves to be saved. Hit like and drop a comment with the city and country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. The morning Amara Belrose lost everything, it was raining. Not the cinematic kind of rain that signals something important is coming. The ordinary Chicago November kind, cold, sideways, mean, the sort that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and stays there. She had been on hour 11 of a 12-hour trauma shift when the charge nurse called her into the supply room and told her not to make a scene. Amara had made a scene anyway, not because she wanted to, because she had seen what was written in a patient's chart, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who has spent 6 years cross-referencing medication orders and reading physician shorthand in bad lighting, that what was written was not what had happened. The dosage was wrong. The attending physician listed was not the attending physician who had treated the patient, and the clinic code stamped in the margin of the digital record, a small detail, easy to miss, pointed to a private facility that Amara had never heard of and had no reason to be attached to a Lake Haven patient file. She flagged it. She was told it was a clerical error. She flagged it again, this time in writing, addressed to 3 separate administrators. The 3rd flag is what ended her. 2 days later, a controlled medication count came up short. Security footage, later reviewed by investigators who were not working for Amara, showed a figure in scrubs removing items from the locked cabinet. The footage was grainy. The timestamps were inconsistent in ways that a casual reviewer would not catch. But the figure's approximate height and build, according to the internal report filed by Nurse Director Patricia Voss, were consistent with Amara Belrose. Her badge was deactivated before she reached the parking garage. She stood at her car for a long time in the cold, holding her phone, cycling through the contacts of people she had believed were her friends. Her mentor, Dr. Claudia Marsh, did not answer. Her shift supervisor sent back a text that said only, "I'm sorry, I can't get involved." The union representative she reached told her, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound sympathetic while committing to nothing, that the evidence was not favorable and she should consider her options. Her nursing license was suspended pending investigation 14 days later. She lost her apartment 2 months after that, when the suspension turned into a formal board proceeding that consumed every dollar she had managed to save. 6 years of trauma nursing, of double shifts and birthday parties missed and hands held through things that would give anyone nightmares. 6 years of being the nurse other nurses called when a situation was going sideways and they needed someone who would not panic. Gone. Filed away in a disciplinary record under charges she had not committed, next to a physician's signature she had never seen before the day her badge stopped working. She did not leave Chicago. That was the thing that surprised people later, the ones who tried to construct a narrative around her that made sense to them. They expected her to go home, back to her mother in Memphis, or to a cousin somewhere, or simply away, the way people go away when a city has used them up and discarded the evidence. Amara stayed, She could not have explained it clearly at the time. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was more that she had looked at the canvas bag sitting on the passenger seat of her car, the bag with the printed charts, the copied records, the photographs of inconsistent timestamps, the handwritten log she had been keeping for 3 weeks before they shut her down. And she had understood that leaving meant those papers went nowhere. And she had watched a man die on a table once because the right information arrived 4 minutes too late. She was not going to be 4 minutes late again. She stayed. The car lasted another month before she could no longer afford the insurance. She stored it in a lot near Pilsen, paid the first 2 weeks, and then stopped being able to pay. She did not know what happened to it after that. She moved through 3 different shelters over the following 4 months, learning the specific rhythms of each one. Which nights the bathrooms were least crowded, which staff members would look the other way when she slipped her canvas bag under a cot, instead of checking it at the desk, which other residents could be trusted and which ones would go through your things the moment you left the room. She stopped sleeping well. She started waking at 3 in the morning with the specific kind of alertness that belongs to people whose nervous systems have decided safety is no longer a default assumption. But she kept working. Not officially, not with a license or a badge or any of the institutional legitimacy she had spent her adult life building. She worked the way people work when the institutions have failed them, and there is still a gap that needs filling. The shelter on West Madison had an elderly population that rotated in and out, and almost none of them had consistent access to medication management or wound care. Amara knew wound care the way a musician knows their instrument, not from a manual, but from hands, from repetition, from having done it in conditions that did not resemble anything a textbook anticipated. She cleaned infected cuts. She helped residents track their blood pressure readings. She sat with a 73-year-old man named Clifford who had uncontrolled diabetes and no one who understood what the numbers on his glucometer meant. And she explained it to him in language that was not condescending, in the way she had always believed explanation should work. She did not tell anyone she was a nurse. She just helped. It was Clifford who called her that eventually. Not to her face, but to the shelter coordinator, an overworked woman named Denise who had 3 times caught Amara in the supply closet doing something she was technically not authorized to do. Clifford told Denise that the woman in bed 14 with the canvas bag was a real nurse, and she was the reason his foot wasn't infected anymore. Denise looked at Amara's face for a long moment and said nothing, and then turned around and walked back to her desk, which was the closest thing to permission Amara received for the next 4 months. She had been at Lake Haven for 6 years. She had learned exactly how a medical conspiracy hides itself inside legitimate paperwork. She had time now, and she had the evidence she had gathered before they shut her down. And she had a methodical mind that did not get distracted by the emotional weight of what had been done to her. Or mostly didn't. There were nights. There were nights when the weight pressed down and she lay on the cot listening to the sound of other people's difficult sleep and thought about her nursing board certificate framed on the wall of an apartment she no longer had access to, and the anger that moved through her was not righteous or productive. It was just hot and shapeless, and it didn't help anything. She let it move through her, and then she got up and wrote more notes in the margins of her documents. She had been doing this for nearly a year when she identified Dr. Everett Sable. She had suspected him early. His name appeared in the physician record of the altered chart that had started everything. But suspicion and evidence are different categories, and Amara understood that difference with the precision of someone who had watched a regulatory board dismiss insufficient evidence once already. She needed something that did not bend. She needed paper that told the same story from 2 different directions so that the person reading it could not pretend the story wasn't there. What she found, slowly and carefully, through public records requests and the patient advocacy network she had quietly built inside 3 different shelters, was the name Marissa Calder. Calder was not a physician. She was not anyone's idea of a healthcare professional. She was a private investor, the kind whose name appeared on clinic boards in small print and whose financial relationships with the physicians running those clinics were structured to look like nothing unusual. But Amara had learned to read that kind of structure. She had learned it the way you learn something you never intended to study, by having it used against you and then spending months taking it apart to understand the mechanism. The private clinic codes and the altered patient records were not random. They were routing identifiers. Each one corresponded to a facility within Marissa Calder's investment portfolio. Each one, Amara had eventually established, was connected to a billing pattern that should have triggered regulatory review and hadn't, because the physician records backing up those bills, records like the altered chart that had started everything, were clean. They had been cleaned by people inside Lake Haven who knew how the system worked and who had decided the system was more useful as a tool than as a standard. She needed to get back inside the hospital. She needed the archived patient records. The physical archive, the paper trail that predated the digital system Lake Haven had implemented 3 years ago. The records that had not been migrated because migrating them would have required someone to look at them carefully, and that was the one thing the people running this operation could not afford. She was standing outside the emergency entrance at 7:40 in the morning, working up the nerve, when Patricia Voss's voice split the air. "Remove her. Now!" Amara stood still and held the canvas bag and did not give Patricia Voss the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She was aware of how she looked. She was aware of the borrowed scrubs and the coat that was not quite right for the weather and the fact that her hair needed more attention than she'd been able to give it. She was aware that the people watching her, the orderlies, the techs, the nurses she had worked beside, were performing a calculation in real time, measuring what they saw against what they remembered, and that the calculation was not coming out in her favor. Marcus Webb laughed. She recognized the sound the way you recognize something that should hurt more than it does. She had covered his shift twice. She had stayed 4 extra hours both times. He had sent her a text that said, "You're the best." Bell rose, and she had saved it in the unimportant folder where she kept texts she didn't want to delete, but didn't look at often enough to justify a better location. Patricia stepped closer and said something else. Lower now, meant only for Amara. The words are not worth repeating because they were designed to do one thing, and Amara had made the decision that they were not going to do that thing. She looked at Patricia Voss's face and saw, with the clinical clarity she had never entirely been able to turn off, a person performing contempt for an audience, which meant the contempt was at least partly manufactured, which meant Patricia was at least partly afraid of something. Amara found that interesting. She was still finding it interesting when she heard the motorcycles. It was a sound that did not belong to a hospital morning. Low and organized, the particular rhythm of an escort formation, the kind you heard when someone important was moving through the city and the city was expected to accommodate the movement. She turned her head. They all did. The small crowd that had gathered to watch Patricia Voss remove a homeless woman from the premises, and saw the convoy coming down the block. Black vehicles. 4 of them. The lead car flanked by 2 motorcycles and followed by a third, moving at a pace that was not hurried and not slow, but simply inevitable, the pace of something that has already determined it will arrive. They pulled up at the hospital entrance. The lead escort car stopped. Patricia had stopped talking. Everyone had stopped talking. The security guard who had been moving toward Amara stopped moving. The rear door of the lead car opened. Kang Tae-jun stepped out. He was 41, Korean, and the kind of man who wore a suit the way other men wear armor, not for decoration, but as a deliberate statement about the terms of any interaction you were about to have with him. He was not large in the way that announces itself loudly. He was precise. Everything about him was precise. The set of his shoulders, the angle of his attention, the way he paused before moving, like someone who had spent decades making sure that the next thing he did was the right thing. Hospital administrators had come out of the entrance to meet him. Lake Haven was receiving a significant donation from one of Tae-jun's legitimate business holdings. This had been arranged through channels Amara was not yet aware of, announced 2 weeks earlier in a brief press item in the business section of the Tribune that had mentioned his name in association with healthcare infrastructure investment and nothing else. The administrators were smiling. They were in the practiced attitudes of people preparing to receive someone whose money they needed. Tae-jun looked at none of them. He looked at Amara. He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that everyone else began to understand that something was happening they had not prepared for. And then he walked past the administrators without acknowledgement and crossed the distance between the car and the entrance doors and came to a stop in front of her. He was close enough that she could see his face clearly. She did not know him. She was certain she had never seen him before. I was looking at her with an expression that was not pity, was not calculation, was not the performed compassion of a powerful man making a public gesture. It was recognition, as though he had been looking for something for a long time and had walked around a corner and found it standing in borrowed scrubs holding a canvas bag. He took off his coat. He placed it around her shoulders. It was heavy and warm, and it smelled like cedar and something she couldn't identify. and she stood very still because she did not know what this was, and her instinct around things she did not understand was to remain still until she understood them. He said quietly, so that it was meant only for her, "Who destroyed your life?" The security guard did not move. Patricia Voss did not move. Marcus Webb had stopped laughing some time ago. Amara looked at the man who had just asked her the only question that mattered. She did not answer immediately. She was not the kind of person who answered important questions immediately. She looked at his face and saw that he was waiting, that he was prepared to wait, that whatever had brought him to this entrance, to this specific woman, on this specific morning, it was not impulse. He had known she would be here. He had come because she would be here. She said, "You know who I am." It was not a question. He said, "I know what they did to you. That's not the same thing." She considered that. The coat was very warm. She had been cold for a long time. She looked at Patricia Voss, who was standing very still with an expression that was working hard to maintain its architecture, and at the administrators behind her whose smiles had gone somewhere uncertain, and at the small crowd of people who had gathered to watch her humiliation and were now watching something else entirely. She looked back at Tae-jun. "Everett Sable," she said, "and a woman named Marissa Calder. They built something inside this hospital, and they used it to destroy me when I got too close." He listened to both names and did not react to them visibly, but something moved behind his eyes that she filed away and thought about later. "I have evidence," she said. "Some of it, not enough to move a board and make it stick. I need what's inside that archive room." She nodded toward the building. "Third floor. Records that haven't been digitized. They'll tell the rest of the story." He said, "How long have you been building this?" "Almost a year." He looked at her in the cold morning air, at the canvas bag she was holding, at the coat that was his that was now around her shoulders, at the hospital where the people who had laughed at her 30 seconds ago were now very quiet. "You stayed," he said. "I couldn't leave." "Why?" She thought about Clifford and his glucometer. She thought about the man who had died because the right information arrived 4 minutes too late. She thought about the chart with the wrong dosage and the clinic code she was not supposed to have noticed, and the 6 years of work that had been filed away under someone else's narrative. Because the truth doesn't stop being true just because someone decided it was inconvenient, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew a nurse once who saved my niece's life and refused to take any money for it. She told me she'd done what any nurse should do." He paused. "I looked for her for 3 years after she lost her license. I had people looking. It was harder than it should have been." Amara went very still. She remembered it. Of course she remembered it. She had not known who the frightened girl was, or who the girl's uncle was. She had known only that the girl was terrified and injured and alone, and that the situation required specific, careful attention. She had given it. She had refused the envelope that was pressed on her afterward because she had not treated the girl in order to receive an envelope. She remembered the man who had offered it. She had not seen his face clearly. She was seeing it clearly now. "That was your niece," she said. "That was my niece," he said. Around them, Chicago kept moving. Somewhere inside the hospital, a monitor was beeping. The cold was the cold it had always been. Patricia Voss stood with her hands at her sides and said nothing. Amara looked at the man in front of her, the man whose coat she was wearing, whose niece she had held together in a trauma bay 3 years ago, who had just walked past a receiving line of hospital administrators as though they were furniture in order to stand in front of a homeless nurse. And she made a decision, not to trust him. She was not built for immediate trust, to proceed. "I need to get into that archive," she said, "and I need to stay alive while I do it. Those are the 2 things I need." He nodded, once. "Then those are the 2 things you'll have," he said. Patricia Voss opened her mouth. Tae-jun looked at her, just looked. He did not speak. Patricia closed her mouth. The administrator shifted and said nothing. Amara tightened her grip on the canvas bag and looked at the hospital entrance and thought about a chart with a wrong dosage and a clinic code no one was supposed to notice, and nearly a year of cold mornings and difficult sleep and writing in margins. She thought about how far she had come carrying something no one else had been willing to carry. She took a breath. She did not go inside yet. There was more to understand first. There was a man beside her who had walked a long way to find her, for reasons she was only beginning to trace, and before she walked back into the building that had destroyed her, she needed to know who she was walking beside. But the laughter had stopped. Every person who had stood in that entrance bay and laughed at the homeless woman in borrowed scrubs was now very quiet, and Amara Belrose stood in a coat that was not hers in the cold November air and felt, for the first time in almost a year, the particular sensation of the ground becoming solid again beneath her feet. Not safe, not finished, not even close to finished, but solid. And sometimes solid is enough to start from. They did not go inside the hospital that morning. Taejun made that decision in the space between one breath and the next, reading the situation the way he had learned to read rooms over 20 years of operating in spaces where the wrong read got people killed. The administrators were still standing near the entrance doors, smiling with their mouths and doing something else entirely with their eyes. Patricia Voss had retreated 3 steps, but had not gone inside, which meant she was watching and reporting in real time to someone who needed to know what was happening. 2 of the hospital's contracted security guards had positioned themselves near the entrance in a way that was meant to look casual and wasn't. He put his hand at the small of Amara's back, not gripping, just present, a pressure that said, "We are moving," and guided her away from the entrance toward the lead car. She stiffened, slightly, but he felt it. He said very quietly, "Not yet. Not today." She said, "I came here for a reason." "I know. And the people inside know you came here for a reason. That's the problem." She looked at the hospital entrance. He watched her look at it, the set of her jaw, the way her hand tightened on the canvas bag, the exact calibration of every instinct she had, telling her to go through those doors and finish what she'd started. He recognized the feeling because he had spent his entire adult life feeling its opposite, which was the instinct to strike before the window closed. "If they've been watching you," he said, "and they have been watching you, walking in there today means walking in when they're ready. That's not a door. That's a throat." A long pause. She said, "You've been watching me too." "Yes." "For how long?" 6 weeks. She turned then and looked at him fully, and the look was not grateful and not warm and not any of the things that people expected women in her position to produce on demand. It was the look of someone filing a fact away in a place where it could be examined properly later. "We'll discuss that," she said. "We will," he agreed. She got in the car. He did not follow immediately. He turned and looked at Patricia Voss. Just looked. No expression, no gesture. And then he looked at the 2 security guards and then at the cluster of former colleagues who had been laughing 12 minutes ago and were now arranged in the postures of people who wished they were somewhere else. He let the look last exactly as long as it needed to last. Then he got in the car. The convoy moved. Inside the car it was warm and quiet, and the leather smelled expensive in a way that was not aggressive about it, which Amara noted because she had learned to read spaces. She sat with the canvas bag on her lap and Taejun's coat still around her shoulders. She had not given it back, and he had not asked for it, and watched Chicago move past the tinted windows. Across from her, Taejun sat with his hands loose on his thighs and said nothing. He was giving her time to think, she realized. He understood that she needed time to think. That was either a very good sign or an extremely calculated one, and she was not yet equipped to determine which. She said, "How did you find me?" Not a question, a demand. He said, "A woman named Denise at the West Madison shelter. She called a contact of mine 8 weeks ago. She said she had a resident who was treating people without a license and she wasn't going to report it, but she wanted someone to know in case anything happened to the woman." He paused. "In case anything happened to you." Amara looked out the window. Denise, who had walked into the supply closet and turned around and walked back to her desk 3 times and never said a word. "She didn't tell me," Amara said. "She didn't want to scare you off. She said you were the kind of person who would disappear if you thought someone powerful was paying attention." Amara thought about whether that was true. She decided it was partially true, which was the most honest assessment she could give it. "Your niece," she said. "How is she?" Something moved across his face. Not sentiment exactly, more like the specific softness that appears in very controlled people when something reaches them before they can prepare for it. "She's 22 now," he said. "She finished her first year of university last spring. Biology." He stopped. "She wants to go into medicine." Amara said nothing. He said, "She remembers you. She doesn't know your name, but she has described you to me many times. She says you spoke to her in a voice that made her feel like the fear was allowed, like she didn't have to hold it together. He looked at Amara directly. Most people talk to frightened patients like the fear is a problem to be managed. You let her have the fear. She has never forgotten that. Amara's throat tightened. She pressed it flat and said, "Where are we going?" "Somewhere to talk." "I want a location," he told her. A restaurant in Wicker Park closed on Monday mornings, owned by a man who had worked for him for 11 years and who swept the place for listening devices every morning out of habit. Amara listened to this and said nothing and filed it in the place where she kept things that told her something true about a person's daily life. A man who sweeps for listening devices every morning out of habit is a man who has been listened to in ways he didn't authorize, which meant he operated in a world where that was a reasonable expectation, which meant the world she was now adjacent to was a specific and dangerous kind. She already knew that. She had known it when she got in the car. The restaurant was called Sona. Dark wood, paper lanterns, tables pushed to the edges to create a clear sightline from any seat to any door. A man in his 50s, who Taijun called Mr. Park, brought tea without being asked, and then positioned himself near the back, without crowding the room. Two of Taijun's people remained outside. The third, a woman Amara hadn't noticed until she moved, took a position just inside the entrance. Amara spread her documents on the table. She did not ask permission. She did not frame it as a presentation. She simply laid them out in the order that told the story most efficiently and began explaining what she had found. And she explained it the way she had always explained a patient's condition to a physician who needed to act on the information, precisely, without editorializing, with the evidence given in the sequence that made the logic apparent. Taejun listened without interrupting for 18 minutes. When she finished, he sat for a moment with both hands around his tea. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. He said, "The clinic codes. Calder's facilities." "Yes. I know two of those clinic names," he said. "Not because I've been inside them. Because 3 years ago I had a business contact who mentioned Marissa Calder as someone building a healthcare portfolio. He described her as aggressive and well-connected and comfortable with arrangements that didn't survive close examination." "Did you pursue it?" "No. It was outside my area. I had no reason to look closer." He paused, and something tightened in his jaw. "I should have looked closer." "Why?" He said, "Because 2 years ago, one of my people ended up in a private clinic that I believe is on your list. He was treated for an injury that required discretion. He paid well for that discretion. 3 months later, I found out his records had been altered and the billing from his visit had been used to run charges through an insurance network I had no involvement with." He looked at her. "Someone used my organization's need for privacy to launder their billing fraud inside our silence." The room was very still. Amara said, "They've been doing it to everyone who needed to stay quiet. Patients who couldn't complain. Criminal organizations who wouldn't go to authorities. Medical tourists. People whose immigration status made noise dangerous." She tapped the documents. "Calder built the financial architecture. Sable provides the clinical cover. Lakehaven is the anchor institution that makes it all look legitimate." Taejun set down his tea. He said, "What do you need from me?" She had prepared for several versions of this conversation. She had prepared for negotiation, for conditions, for the particular kind of transactional logic that powerful people applied to situations where they were being asked for something. She had prepared talking points and fallback positions and a clear understanding of the minimum she needed to function. She had not prepared for the question to be that clean and that direct. She said, "Protection, not money. I don't want your money." "I know. I need to get back into Lakehaven. Third floor archive. The records that are still on paper, pre-2021, before they migrated the system. They couldn't migrate those files because migrating them would have required someone to read them, and reading them means the billing pattern becomes visible, so they're still sitting in paper boxes in a room that almost nobody goes into." She looked at him. "I need access to that room, and I need enough of a buffer around me that when I go in, I'm not walking into whatever they've set up. They'll have set something up. I know. You know, and you still want to go in. I know, and I have no other option," she said. "The records I have," she indicated the documents on the table, "they tell enough of the story to be interesting to a journalist. They don't tell enough to move a regulatory board and survive the legal counterpunch Calder can afford to throw. I need the paper archive." He looked at the documents for a long moment. He said, There's a man on Lake Haven's security staff. His name is Dennis Cho. He's worked third-floor access for 4 years, and he has been on my payroll for 2 of them. Not for anything involving the hospital, for information about the neighborhood, real estate patterns, city contract movements, the kind of information that a hospital administrator hears without realizing it's valuable. He paused. He can get us a window. Amara said, How long a window? 40 minutes, maybe 50. That's enough. If you know exactly where to look. I know exactly where to look. He studied her. She let him study her. She was aware that he was performing a calculation of his own, not about whether to trust her, she didn't think, but about what kind of person she was, whether the precision she was projecting was real or constructed, whether she would hold up under the specific pressures that were coming. She had spent a year being assessed by shelter staff and advocacy workers, and the occasional investigative journalist who expressed interest and then disappeared, and she had learned to sit inside that assessment without flinching. He said, My organization has resources, people who can move information and pressure without leaving a signature. I can put those resources behind your evidence. She said, I need to be clear about something. Go ahead. I'm not running a mafia operation. I'm not building leverage. I'm not interested in what happens to Sable and Calder beyond them being exposed and processed through the legal system. If I find out that any part of what I'm doing is being used to serve your organization's interests in ways I haven't agreed to, I stop, completely. And whatever I've shared with you, I share with someone else. He didn't look offended. He looked interested. He said, You told me that in a restaurant owned by one of my employees, with 3 of my people between you and the door. Yes, she said. Because it needed to be said here. He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the expression of someone encountering a species of directness they had not recently interacted with. He said, Agreed. She believed him enough to continue. Not completely. Enough. They spent the next 2 hours working through the operational details, which is where abstractions become real and where Amara's year of methodical documentation proved its value. She had a timeline. She had cross-referenced the clinic codes against billing cycles. She had the names of 4 patients whose records she believed had been altered, 2 of whom she had made contact with through the shelter network, both of whom were willing to speak on record if the right legal framework could be constructed around them. Taejun listened to all of it. He asked precise questions, not the questions of someone performing engagement, but the questions of someone who understood information architecture and was identifying gaps. He asked about the chain of custody for her documents. He asked whether anyone else had copies. He asked about her contact with the 2 patients, and what exactly they had told her and what they knew about each other. She answered everything. At one point, Mr. Park brought food she hadn't ordered, rice, soup, something braised, and set it quietly on the table, and she realized she was hungry in a way that had become so familiar it had stopped registering as hunger specifically, and had just become a background condition of her existence. She ate without stopping the conversation and did not thank him or make a production of it, and he disappeared again without waiting for acknowledgement. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, Taejun said, You need somewhere to stay. She said, I have somewhere. He looked at her. She said, The shelter is fine. He said, The shelter is not fine. They know you're looking. They have been watching the shelter network since your first public records request. I have reason to believe there is a person inside the West Madison facility who has been providing your location to someone connected to Sable. The words landed. She set down her spoon. She thought about the canvas bag that she had been protecting like it contained her organs. She thought about the cot with the specific loose legs she'd learned to avoid. She thought about Clifford and his glucometer and Denise, who had called a contact she'd never mentioned. She said, How long have you known? 4 days. 4 days. I was trying to confirm it before telling you. She looked at him for a long moment, and the look was not warm. You watched me sleep in a building where someone was reporting on me for 4 days, she said, while you were trying to confirm it. He held her look and did not make excuses. Yes, he said. That's not acceptable. No, he said. It isn't. The agreement did not help as much as she wanted it to. She breathed through it. In the room, the woman near the entrance shifted her weight. Outside, a bus went by. Amara looked at her documents on the table, a year of work spread between a teacup and a bowl of soup, and thought about the specific vulnerability of being someone whose entire operation lived inside a single canvas bag in a building where she did not control who came and went. She said, "I'll need 3 days to make other arrangements." He said, "You can stay here." In a restaurant. Above it, there are 3 rooms. They're used for various purposes. One of them will be yours until this is finished. She started to say something. He said, "I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you operational security. There's a difference." She thought about it. She thought about Denise, who had called a contact without telling her. She thought about the person in the shelter who had been reporting her location. She thought about the 4 days she had slept in a building while someone she didn't know had confirmed a threat she didn't know existed. She said, "I look at those rooms before I agree to anything." Of course. The rooms were above the restaurant, accessed by a staircase through the kitchen. The first room was used for storage and smelled like it. The second had a desk, a cot, a window that faced the alley, and a lock on the door that was a serious lock. Not a doorknob lock, but a deadbolt that had been installed by someone who understood what a deadbolt was for. The third room was empty. She stood in the second room and tested the deadbolt, and looked at the window and estimated the drop to the alley, and looked at the desk and thought, "I can work here." She went back downstairs and said, "I'll stay 3 days. After that, I need to reassess." He said, "That's reasonable." She moved her things from the West Madison shelter that afternoon. There was not much to move. The canvas bag, a second set of clothes she kept in a plastic bag inside the canvas bag, a notebook, a phone charger with a cracked casing that still worked if you positioned it correctly, the glucometer she had been borrowing from Denise's supply to check Clifford's numbers. She left Clifford with written instructions about the readings. 3 pages, clear and specific, with the range numbers circled and the action steps written in a font size that accounted for the fact that his reading glasses were old. She handed them to him in the common room, and he looked at them and then looked at her and said, "You coming back?" She said, "I'll check on you." He said, "That's not what I asked." She looked at the old man with his worn glucometer and his diabetes that nobody had bothered to explain to him and said, "I'm working on something. It might take a while, but I'll check on you." He nodded. He folded the papers with the care of someone who understood these papers were important, even without understanding entirely why. She left. She did not cry in the cab that Taejun's driver took her in. She looked out the window and breathed and let the day move through her without letting it knock her sideways. She was good at that. She had been practicing for a long time. The next 9 days were structured and careful, and moved at the pace of people who understood they were operating on borrowed time. Taejun's people ran background on Dennis Cho's schedule and identified a rotation gap on Thursday evenings between 7:15 and 8:40 that left the third-floor archive without direct coverage. Dennis would need to create a secondary gap in the digital log, a routine maintenance flag that would explain the 40-minute window in the access records. He had done similar things before, Taejun said, and had not yet given anyone reason to look closely. Amara spent those 9 days doing 2 things simultaneously. The first was preparing for the archive. She had a list of the specific records she needed, patient file numbers she had reconstructed from the altered chart records in her possession, cross-referenced against the billing cycles she had mapped. She knew what she was looking for. She practiced the search in her head until she could see the filing system and navigate it without hesitation. The second thing she was doing was watching Taejun, not suspiciously, methodically, the way she had always assessed the people she had to trust before she fully trusted them, looking for the gap between what someone said and what they did, between the performance of reliability and the actual fact of it. What she found was complicated. He ran a criminal organization. She had known this in the abstract, but the days above the restaurant filled in the specific details in ways that the abstract had not. The people who came and went, not many, but some, moved in the specific patterns of people inside a hierarchy she was not part of and did not entirely understand. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Taejun never appeared to give orders in her presence, but she understood that orders were being given somewhere, by someone, in structures that ran parallel to the one she was operating inside. And yet, he had set up a call with a patient advocacy attorney named Gloria Reyes. Without being asked, because he had identified correctly that what Amara needed for the 2 patients willing to speak on record was a legal framework that could withstand Calder's counterattack. He had not told Amara to take the meeting. He had told her the meeting was available if she wanted it. She had taken it. Gloria Reyes was a small woman who wore sensible shoes and asked questions that revealed a mind that did not make assumptions. She listened to Amara's evidence with the focused attention of someone who had seen regulatory systems used as weapons before and had developed a precise understanding of how to fight back. She said, "If you get me the archive records and they show what you believe they show, I can build a filing that will survive a legal challenge." Probably. The probably is honest. Calder has money. Money makes probably complicated. Amara said, "I'll get you the records." Gloria looked at her steadily. "How?" she said. Amara said, "Carefully." Gloria looked at her for a moment longer and then said, "I don't want to know the specifics. I want to know that no one is going to be hurt." "No one is going to be hurt," Amara said. "I'm going in to photograph documents, that's all." Gloria nodded and said nothing else about it. On the fourth day, Taejun came to her room, knocked, waited, entered only when she opened the door, and stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides and said, "Sable knows you're not at the shelter." She had been sitting at the desk with her documents. She set her pen down. "How?" "The person reporting your location checked in and had nothing to report. When you disappear instead of moving to a known address, that's its own kind of information." He leaned against the door frame. "He's moving faster than I anticipated. He filed an amended complaint with the nursing board yesterday, added language about criminal associations. He's building a narrative that links your investigation to organized crime." She understood what that meant. If the narrative landed, if the board and the press and the regulatory structure came to see her evidence as the output of a criminal operation rather than a legitimate investigation, then nothing she found in that archive would be usable. Everything she brought forward would be contaminated by its origin. A mafia-adjacent source of information was not a source. It was a motive to be investigated. She said, "He found out about you. He found out that someone has been protecting you. He doesn't have my name yet, but he's close." She looked at her documents. She thought about the architecture she had built over nearly a year and the specific load-bearing element that was the archive records, the piece without which the whole structure was interesting but not decisive. She said, "We moved the timeline." He said, "That's what I think too." She said, "How soon can Dennis Cho give us the window?" He said, "I talked to him an hour ago. He can create the gap day after tomorrow, Wednesday, 7:20 to 8:15. She looked at the calendar on her phone. 55 minutes. She had planned for 50. She could do 50. She said, "Wednesday." He said, "There's something else." His voice had changed. Not dramatically. A fraction. Enough that she looked up from the phone. "I had a conversation this afternoon with someone who works inside Lake Haven's administrative structure. Someone who is not connected to Sable, who has their own reasons for being uncomfortable with what has been happening inside that hospital." He paused. "She told me that the paper archive has been flagged for digitization review. The review is scheduled for next Monday." Amara went very still. "Digitization review," she said slowly, "means someone goes in and reads the files before they're migrated." "Yes. And if someone connected to Sable is overseeing that review, the specific records you need will not survive the review," he said. She looked at the window. The alley was dark. Somewhere below, the restaurant was closed for the evening, and Mr. Park had gone home. She thought about a year. She thought about borrowed scrubs and a canvas bag pressed against her ribs like something worth dying for. She thought about the man who died because the right information arrived 4 minutes too late, and the promise she had made to herself in the parking garage the night they deactivated her badge. She said, "We have to go Wednesday. There is no other option." He said, "Yes." She said, "And if it goes wrong, if Sable has someone watching the archive room, if Dennis Cho's log flag doesn't hold," he said, "I'll have people in position." She said, "I don't want anyone hurt." He looked at her. "I don't want anyone hurt," she said again, and this time it was not a statement of preference but a condition. "If this becomes a confrontation inside that building, the story changes. I'm not clearing my name through something that puts people in a hospital. Are we clear?" He held her look for a long moment. She held his. He said, "We're clear." She believed him. Mostly. It was the mostly that kept her up that night, sitting at the desk with her documents in the quiet room above the restaurant, working through every variable she could name and some she suspected she was missing, writing notes in the margins of her own careful year of work, as the clock moved toward a Wednesday that was coming whether she was ready or not. The canvas bag sat on the floor beside the desk. She pressed her foot against it, feeling its weight, the specific density of paper that tells the truth about things people needed to stay hidden. She pressed her foot against it and kept writing. Wednesday was coming, and Everett Sable was already moving to make sure she would not survive it. Wednesday came in cold and overcast, the kind of Chicago evening that pressed down on the city like a lid. Amara had not slept the night before. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear. She had been running the archive layout in her head, the way she had once run trauma protocols before difficult shifts, working through each variable until the sequence was automatic enough that her hands would know what to do even if her mind went sideways under pressure. File cabinet positions. Estimated search time per drawer. The specific patient file numbers written on a strip of paper she had taped to the inside of her wrist under her sleeve, because phones could be taken, but a strip of paper under a sleeve required someone to already have their hands on you. She dressed at 6. Dark clothing, practical shoes, nothing that would snag or slow her. She checked the canvas bag one last time. Not all of it was going in with her. The bulk of her documentation she left in the room above the restaurant in a waterproof folder she had purchased 3 days earlier, with Gloria Reyes' contact information written on the outside in permanent marker. If she did not come back, the folder stayed. If the folder stayed, Gloria would eventually find it. She had thought through that possibility with the same methodical calm she applied to everything else, which was the only way she knew to think through the possibility of not coming back. Taejun was in the restaurant when she came downstairs. He was sitting at the table nearest the kitchen with a cup of coffee he had not been drinking, and when she appeared, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. She looked back. They had been in the same building for 9 days, and she had developed a working understanding of his silences, which ones were processing and which ones were deciding and which ones were the particular silence of a man who had something to say and was measuring whether this was the moment to say it. This was the last kind. She said, "Say it." He said, "I could go in instead." She said, "You don't know what you're looking for." "You could tell me." "I spent a year building the knowledge of what I'm looking for. I can't transfer that in a morning." She looked at him steadily. "And you walking into Lake Haven's archive is a different story than me walking in. I'm a former employee returning to a hospital. You are something the press will construct a narrative around in 48 hours. He said, "I know." She said, "Then why did you say it?" He looked at his untouched coffee. He said, "Because I have sent people into situations, and some of them did not come out the way I expected, and I have learned to say the thing I'm thinking before I decide not to say it." She stood with that for a moment. She said, "I'll be out in 50 minutes. He looked up. She said, "Have your people where you need them, but outside. Nobody comes inside unless I call it." He said, "Agreed." She picked up the reduced canvas bag, camera phone, latex gloves, the patient file list on her wrist, a small flashlight, and walked to the door. Behind her, she heard him stand. She did not turn around. The driver took her to within 2 blocks of Lake Haven and let her out. She walked the rest. The evening shift change had happened at 7. Dennis Cho's maintenance flag had gone into the system at 7:16. She had 11 minutes to reach the 3rd floor before the window opened and 39 minutes after that before the flag expired. She used the east stairwell, staff entrance, badge reader, the duplicate staff ID that Dennis had left in an envelope taped to the underside of a bench in Lake Haven's east parking garage 3 days earlier. She had been told not to think too carefully about how a duplicate staff ID was produced. She had chosen, pragmatically, not to. The badge worked. She took the stairs. 3rd floor was quieter than the clinical wings, less foot traffic, lower lighting in the administrative corridor, the specific silence of a floor that existed to hold paper rather than people. She moved quickly without running, keeping her steps even, looking like someone who knew where she was going, because looking like someone who knows where they're going is the most effective camouflage available to a person walking somewhere they are not supposed to be. The archive room was at the end of the corridor, past 3 administrative offices and a supply room. The door was standard institutional, heavy, no window, a keypad lock that Dennis's duplicate access card was supposed to open. She reached it at 7:24. She pressed the card to the reader. The light blinked red. She pressed it again. Red. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, which was long enough to understand that something had gone wrong, and short enough that she had not yet made a decision she couldn't reverse. She checked the card. It looked identical to the one Dennis had shown her in description. She checked the reader. Standard model, no visible tampering. She pressed the card a third time. Read. The sound she made was not a word. It was the sound of a year compressing itself into a single exhalation and then refusing to be a breakdown because a breakdown was not useful here. She pulled out her phone and typed to the number she had for Taejun's driver. Card not working. 1 minute. The response came in 40 seconds. Dennis says the system was updated this afternoon. New encryption cycle. He didn't know. She looked at the locked door. She looked at the corridor. She had 36 minutes left in a window that was supposed to take her inside a room she was now standing outside of, and the records she needed were on the other side of a door that was not going to open. She thought Sable, not a certainty, but the timing of a system encryption update on the afternoon of the day she was going in was not a coincidence she was willing to accept as coincidence. She typed back, "Is there another entry point? 30 seconds. Dennis says maintenance access panel. South wall of archive, connects to utility corridor. He can unlock that from the building management system, but it will show in the log." She typed, "How long does he have before someone checks the log?" He says he doesn't know. Maybe nobody checks until morning. Maybe someone checks in 20 minutes. He can't be sure. She stood in the corridor and breathed and made the calculation and typed, "Do it." The utility corridor access was a panel she almost missed because it was painted the same color as the wall and had no handle. Just a magnetic release point that clicked open when she pressed the right section of the wall, which Dennis had described by counting ceiling tiles from the supply room door. She counted. She pressed. The panel opened. The utility corridor was narrow and dark and smelled like electrical conduit and old dust. She used the flashlight. The maintenance access to the archive was 20 feet down, another panel, and when it opened, she was inside the room. The archive was not large. Floor-to-ceiling metal shelving, banker's boxes labeled by year and department, a single overhead fluorescent that she did not turn on. Her flashlight cut a narrow beam across the labels, and she moved toward the section she needed, 2019 through 2021, clinical records, the pre-migration files, and found them where the hospital's own digitization memo had described them in the public records document she had obtained 4 months ago. She worked fast. Latex gloves on, phone camera up. She had memorized the file numbers, and she located the first box in 40 seconds and the first file in 90, and she began photographing, page by page, moving through the specific records that connected the clinic codes to the billing cycles to the physician's signatures that should not have been there. It was exactly what she had believed it was. The records were not subtle about it once you knew the structure you were looking at. Multiple patient files with altered attending designations, all routing to the same cluster of clinic codes, all within billing windows that corresponded to the payout cycles she had mapped. Sable's signature appeared 14 times in records where the treating physician was documented elsewhere as having been off-site. The discrepancy was not the kind of thing a casual reviewer would catch. It was precisely the kind of thing a 6-year trauma nurse with a year of motivated analysis would catch. She was 22 minutes in and had photographed 64 pages when she heard the door. Not the utility panel. The main door. The keypad door that had refused her card. The light was the sound first, the specific chunk of a keypad locked door being opened by someone with actual access. Then light, the overhead fluorescent, flooding the room with institutional brightness that she had no time to prepare for. She pressed herself into the shelving and killed her flashlight in the same motion, which put her in a shadow that was real but not deep. 3 seconds of silence. Then a voice she recognized said, "I know you're in here." Everett Sable was 63, silver-haired, the kind of man whose authority had been confirmed so many times that it had become indistinguishable from his posture. He stood in the doorway of the archive room in a suit that was wrong for 7:40 in the evening, too put together, too prepared, the suit of a man who had known he was coming here and had dressed for what he intended to do when he arrived. He was not alone. 2 men behind him, neither of them in scrubs or administrative clothing. Amara did not move. He said, "I've been watching the utility corridor access on my phone for 3 days. Did you think I didn't know about Dennis Cho?" The specific coldness that moved through her was not fear in the way fear usually moved. It was the coldness of a structural failure, the feeling of something you built with care, revealing the place where you did not build it carefully enough. She stepped out of the shadow. There was no point in the shadow anymore. She said, "Where's Dennis?" Sable said, "Mr. Cho has been suspended pending an investigation into unauthorized system access. He's being interviewed right now." He looked at her with an expression that had no heat in it, which was worse than anger. "You should be more careful about who you trust." She said, "How long have you known?" "About Dennis specifically? 2 weeks? About your arrangement with Kong Tai-jun?" He tilted his head slightly. "A little longer than that." She held very still. He walked into the room slowly, the walk of someone who has arranged the situation to his satisfaction and is now moving through it at the pace he prefers. He looked at the open banker's boxes. He looked at the phone in her hand. He said, "Give me the phone." She said, "No." He said, "There are 2 ways this ends tonight. The first way is you give me the phone, you leave this building, and I file a report in the morning describing an unauthorized entry by a former employee with a history of theft. Your nursing board case is reopened. You will not practice medicine again." He paused. "The second way involves the police who are currently 3 minutes from this building, and the amended criminal complaint I filed this afternoon that connects your activities to Kong Tai-jun's organization. Conspiracy. Organized crime facilitation. Evidence tampering." She said, "You filed the complaint this afternoon." "Yes." She thought about Tae-jun's warning. He's moving faster than I anticipated. She thought about Wednesday, about the timeline she had moved up because the archive was going to be reviewed Monday. She thought about the encryption update that afternoon and Dennis Cho suspended and 2 men standing behind Everett Sable who were not hospital staff. She said, "You moved the digitization review up." Something crossed his face. Not guilt, a kind of professional acknowledgement. "The review was moved to Thursday," he said. "You would have found an empty shelf." She had been running on a false timeline. The realization did not arrive loudly. It arrived the way structural damage arrives, quietly, from inside, the specific silence of something that has been holding weight and has stopped. He had known she was coming. He had let her come. He had let her get inside the room and photograph 64 pages, and then he had turned on the light and told her about the police who were 3 minutes away, because what he wanted was not to prevent her from getting the records. What he wanted was to catch her inside the room with the records so that everything she had touched became evidence of criminal conduct rather than evidence of his. She looked at the 64 photographs on her phone. She looked at Sable. She said, "You've been doing this for a long time." He said, "The phone. Now." She thought about Tae-jun outside. She thought about texting him. She thought about what happened if 2 of Tae-jun's people came through the utility panel door in the next 90 seconds, which was the kind of response Tae-jun's people were capable of, and what the narrative became if that happened, a mafia extraction from a restricted hospital archive. Everything Sable had built the amended complaint around, happening in real time, on camera, with witnesses. She heard what she had said to Tae-jun the morning outside the hospital. "If you save me by becoming the monster they expect, they win." She put the phone in her pocket. Sable's expression sharpened. She said, "The photographs are encrypted and uploaded to a cloud account that is not accessible from this device. Deleting the local copies deletes nothing." This was partially true. She had set up the automatic upload 2 days earlier, anticipating exactly this possibility, but she was not certain the upload had completed in the archive's limited Wi-Fi range. She was not going to show him that uncertainty. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "It doesn't matter. The complaint is filed. The connection to Tae-jun's organization is documented. Whatever you photographed in this room was photographed by someone operating in criminal conspiracy. No regulatory board touches that evidence. No journalist runs with it without legal exposure. No attorney builds a case on it." He straightened his jacket. "You've spent a year building something that just became unusable." The police arrived in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, not 3 minutes. There were 4 of them. She knew one by name, Detective Carl Moosen, who had been present at the original internal investigation and whose report had been careful and accurate and had done nothing to help her because the evidence at the time had been arranged too well. He looked at her now with an expression that was not without discomfort. He said, "Ms. Belrose." She said, "Detective." He said, "I need you to come with me." She said, "Am I being arrested?" He said, You're being detained for questioning in connection with an amended complaint filed." She said, "I know about the complaint." He looked at Sable. He looked at the open archive boxes. He looked at Amara. She could see him doing the math. She could see, specifically, that the math was uncomfortable and that the discomfort was the discomfort of a man who understood that a situation had been arranged rather than discovered, but who did not have enough in this moment to say so. She said, "I'll come voluntarily, no cuffs." Musson said, "That's fine." She was walked out through the main hospital corridor, not the utility panel. The main corridor past the nursing station and the patient waiting area and the administrative offices, because Everett Sable had arranged the exit route, and the exit route was a statement. She was walked through the hospital she had worked in for 6 years, in dark clothing that announced she had not arrived by the front door, past people who were going to have opinions about what they saw. She kept her chin up and her eyes forward and did not perform dignity because dignity is not a performance, and she had stopped performing a long time ago. Outside, the cold hit her. Taijun was across the street. I was standing beside the lead car, not in it, standing, watching, and when she came through the doors and he saw her face, he moved toward the street before the man beside him stopped him with a hand on his arm and said something quiet. Taijun stopped. He stood at the curb and looked at Amara being walked toward a police vehicle, and his face was the face of a man who was holding himself very still because the alternative was something he had decided not to do. She looked at him across the street. She shook her head. Once. Small. His jaw set. She got in the police vehicle. The precinct interview room was the color of a decision made by someone who stopped caring. She sat across from Detective Musson and a second detective she didn't know named Priya Okafor, who was younger and sharper and asked better questions. And she answered what she chose to answer and said, "I'm not answering that without an attorney to the rest." And they went around the same circuit 4 times over the course of 90 minutes before Musson leaned back and looked at the ceiling and said, "You're not making this easier on yourself." She said, "I'm not trying to make it easier. I'm trying to make it accurate." Okafor said, "Walk me through your relationship with Kong Taijun." She said, "He offered me protection while I conducted a legitimate investigation into medical fraud at Lake Haven Medical Center. I accepted the protection. I did not accept money. I did not participate in any criminal activity on behalf of his organization." Okafor said, "You were staying in a property associated with his holdings. I was staying in a room above a restaurant while I worked. He provided the space. I provided my own food and my own work and my own methodology. That's a generous arrangement for someone he barely knows." She said, "He knew me well enough to look for me for 3 years after I treated his niece." Okafor paused. Musson looked at her. She said, "I am not a criminal. I am a nurse who exposed a medical fraud operation and was destroyed for it by the people running the operation. What you have in front of you is not a criminal complaint. It's a suppression strategy. And if you're good at your job, Detective Okafor, you know the difference." Okafor looked at her for a long moment. Musson said, "You're free to go. Don't leave the city." She was processed out at 10:53. Her phone was returned. She stood on the precinct steps in the cold and looked at the street and breathed. She turned on her phone. 47 photographs had uploaded before she entered the archive's dead zone. 17 had not. She stood with that number. 47. Enough to show the pattern. Not enough to prove it completely. The critical files, the ones with Sable's signature against documented off-site attendance records, were in the 17 that hadn't uploaded. She knew because she remembered which files she had been photographing when she heard the door. She typed to Taijun, "Out, precinct steps. Don't send the car yet." She needed to stand outside for a moment without being in anyone's car or anyone's restaurant or anyone's arrangement. He replied, "Okay." She stood on the steps and looked at the 47 photographs on her phone and thought about a year. She thought about Clifford. She thought about the man who died 4 minutes too late. She thought about Everett Sable in the archive room with his too-prepared suit and his expression that had no heat in it and his carefully arranged exit route through the main corridor. She thought about what he had said. Whatever you photographed in this room was photographed by someone operating in criminal conspiracy. No regulatory board touches that evidence. He was right. That was the worst part. He was right. And he had been right from the moment she got in Taijun's car on that November morning. And the only question that mattered now was whether she had understood that possibility early enough to have done something about it. She thought she had. She was not certain she had. Taijun arrived 12 minutes later without the car. He walked from the direction of a coffee shop 2 blocks down. On foot, no escort, collar up against the cold, and came to a stop beside a coffee shop 2 blocks down. On foot, no escort, collar up against the cold, and came to a stop beside her on the steps. He looked at her face and did not ask if she was all right, because her face made the question unnecessary. She said, "He knew. He's known for weeks. Dennis, the timeline, the encryption update, all of it was arranged." Taejun said, "I know. I've been on the phone." She said, "He filed a complaint that links my investigation to your organization. The photographs I got, 47 of them, are tainted. Any attorney Calder hires will argue criminal conspiracy in the collection. It poisons the evidence." He said, "Not necessarily." She said, "Explain not necessarily." He said, "The complaint links you to me. It does not necessarily link the evidence to me if the evidence can be shown to have been collected through a legitimate process by a legitimate investigator." He paused. "But that requires separating you from me in a way that can withstand legal scrutiny, and I don't know if that's possible after tonight." She said, "What are you not saying?" He was quiet for a moment. The cold moved between them. He said, "I have financial records, my own, not the kind that are publicly visible. Ledgers from the past 4 years that document the billing fraud connection. The visit my man made to Calder's clinic, the way his records were used, the financial channel it ran through. I have documentation of that because I investigate things that happen inside my organization, and I keep records of what I find." She turned and looked at him. He said, "If I provide those records to investigators, it establishes an independent evidentiary line that doesn't run through you. It shows the fraud from the outside, from the victim's side, from a party that was also used by Calder's system without consent." He stopped. "But providing those records means opening my own books. Not all of it is clean. Investigators who see those ledgers will see other things." She understood what that meant. She said, "You would be exposing yourself." He said, "Selectively, strategically, but yes." She said, "Why?" He looked at the street. He said, "Because you told me the truth in a restaurant 9 days ago, and you went into that building tonight without flinching, and you stood in an interview room for 90 minutes and held your position. And I have been in this city for 20 years, surrounded by people who told me what I wanted to hear, and I find that I am extremely tired of it." She looked at him. He looked back. She said, "If you open those ledgers, it doesn't just affect you." "I know. People who work for you. People who have operated inside structures that those ledgers document." "I know. And you're prepared for that." He said, "I'm prepared for what's necessary." She stood on the precinct steps and looked at the man beside her and thought about what he was offering and what it would cost him and what it would require of her to accept it. She thought about what it meant to take what someone offers when what they're offering is the sacrifice of something large and real in order to protect a truth that is yours, but that they have also, now, decided to claim. She said, "I need to think." He said, "Take the time you need." She said, "I also need to tell you something." He waited. She said, "The 47 photographs I got. I have them. And when I was in that room, I also—" She stopped, recalculating. "I identified 3 specific files that I didn't photograph in time. But I read them. I read the key sections before the door opened. And I have a memory that has been described by multiple people as uncomfortably precise." He looked at her. She said, "I can reconstruct what I read. Not verbatim, but accurately. The question is whether reconstructed testimony from a former nurse who was inside a restricted archive holds up against what Sable has built." He said, "On its own, probably not." She said, "Combined with your ledgers." He said, "Combined with my ledgers, and Gloria Reyes, and the 2 patients willing to speak on record, and the 47 photographs and Dennis Cho, who has not yet decided whether he is going to cooperate with the people who suspended him." He paused. "Combined with all of that, it becomes a different question." She breathed. The cold was the cold it had always been. She said, "If I use your ledgers, if I let you do this, the story of how I cleared my name includes Kang Tae-jun opening his books. That story goes somewhere. It has consequences for how people see what I built." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need it to be clear to investigators, to the board, to Gloria Reyes, that I did not know the extent of your organization's activities when I accepted your protection, that I operated in good faith under a specific agreement with specific boundaries. He said, "That is the truth." She said, "Then I need it documented as the truth, in writing, from you, before we take another step." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "I'll have it written tonight." She looked at the street. She looked at the precinct doors behind her. She looked at the phone in her hand with 47 photographs that were not enough, and might, combined with everything else, be precisely enough. She said, "There's something else we need to discuss." He said, "I know." She said, "The complaint he filed links me to you. The only way to fully separate the evidence from that linkage is if the information about your ledgers comes from you, independently, as a cooperating source, not as my associate, which means you have to go to investigators before I do, separately, voluntarily." He said, "I know." She said, "That means walking into a federal building and opening your financial records to people who will not stop at the parts relevant to Calder." He said, "I know." The night was quiet around them. She said, "Are you ready for that?" He looked at her. He said, "No." He said, "But I'm going to do it." She believed him. It was the first time since the morning outside the hospital that she believed him completely, without the qualifier she had been carrying, because this was the moment where the calculation ended, and what remained was simply a person deciding who they were going to be when the decision was expensive. She said, "Then we have work to do." He said, "Yes." She put her phone in her pocket and walked down the precinct steps into the Chicago cold, and he walked beside her, and behind them the precinct lights were the lights of a building that had processed her and released her, and would, if everything worked the way she needed it to work, be the last time she walked out of a place like that without her name being clean. Ahead of them, the city was dark and wide and full of people who did not yet know what was coming. She knew. She walked toward it. They worked through the night, not metaphorically, literally through it, the kind of night that does not feel like a single continuous thing, but like a series of rooms you pass through, each one colder and more stripped down than the last, until you reach the place where there is nothing left except the work itself and the people doing it. Taejun made 3 calls before midnight. Amara did not hear the conversations, but she heard the tone of them through the walls of the restaurant. Low, precise, the voice of someone giving instructions that were not requests. When he came back to the table, his face was the same as it always was, and she had learned enough about him in 9 days to understand that the sameness was not absence of feeling, but a container for it, a structure he had built over a long time, because the feeling, unconstrained, would have made him dangerous in directions he did not want to be dangerous. She spread her documents on the table again, all of them this time, including the waterproof folder she had come downstairs and retrieved from the room above, because the calculation had changed and the time for stage disclosure was finished. She said, "Gloria needs everything tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. Because when Sable finds out that you're going to cooperate voluntarily, the first thing he does is move to freeze any legal proceedings pending the criminal complaint. If Gloria has already filed, if the regulatory submission is already in the system, the freeze becomes more complicated to execute." Taejun said, "How long does Gloria need to prepare a filing?" She said previously she could move in 72 hours if she had the archive records. She doesn't have the records she expected. She has 47 photographs in my reconstructed testimony. Amara looked at him. "And whatever you give her from your ledgers." He said, "My attorney will need to be present for anything that goes to Gloria. Your attorney needs to be on the phone in the next hour." He looked at her for a moment. Something in the look was not quite what she expected. Not resistance, but a kind of acknowledgement. The look of someone who has made a decision and is now watching the decision become real in a way that decisions, when you make them in the abstract, don't entirely prepare you for. He picked up his phone. His attorney was a man named Raymond Chu, who arrived at 1:15 in the morning, wearing a coat over what were clearly pajama pants, and who did not appear to consider this unusual. He was 60, compact, with the specific watchfulness of a man who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word cost things that couldn't be recovered. He looked at Amara across the table and then looked at Taejun and said, "Show me what we're working with." They worked until 4 in the morning. Raymond Chu asked questions that cut directly to the most legally exposed parts of everything and did not soften the questions because it was 4 in the morning or because Amara was in the room or for any other reason. Amara answered what was hers to answer and stayed quiet for the rest and watched the attorney build a picture of what they had and what it was worth and where it was vulnerable, And the picture that emerged was not comfortable, but it was real, which was the only quality she had ever found useful in a picture. At 2:47, Raymond said, "The reconstructed testimony is the weak point. Any competent defense attorney argues it's fabricated after the fact." Amara said, "I know." He said, "So what holds it up?" She said, "Three things. The 47 photographs show the pattern and establish that I knew what I was looking for before I entered the room, which supports the accuracy of my recall. The two patients on record corroborate the altered file structure on two of the specific cases I'm reconstructing. And," she paused, "Dennis Cho." Raymond looked at her. She said, "Dennis has access logs that show which specific files in that archive were physically accessed in the 48 hours before I went in. If Sable accessed those files to verify they were still in the boxes before he set his trap, and I believe he did, because that's the kind of man who checks his arrangements, then the access log shows the file numbers, which corroborates that those files exist in the form I'm describing." Raymond said, "Cho is suspended. He's suspended pending investigation. He hasn't been charged, and he is currently deciding whether the people who suspended him are the people he wants to be loyal to." She looked at Taejun. "Someone should have that conversation with him before morning." Taejun said, "It's being handled." She did not ask how. At 4, Raymond Chu closed his notebook and said, "I need 6 hours to draft the Cooperative Disclosure Framework. That's the document that governs what Taejun provides to investigators and under what terms. Without that document in place, nothing goes to anyone." He looked at Taejun. "You understand what you're agreeing to?" Taejun said, "Yes." Raymond said, "I want to hear you say it specifically." Taejun said, "I'm providing financial records that document my organization's involvement as victim, not perpetrator, in Calder's billing fraud. I understand that those records will reveal aspects of my organization's operations that will be examined by investigators. I understand that examination may result in legal proceedings separate from the Calder case." Raymond said, "And you're proceeding anyway?" Taejun said, "Yes." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." He stood, picked up his coat, looked at Amara. "Get some sleep. You're going to need to be sharp tomorrow." She said, "I'm aware." He left. She did not sleep. She sat at the table with her documents and her phone and the 47 photographs and worked on the reconstruction of the 3 files she had read before the archive door opened, writing from memory with the specific precision that memory, exercised regularly and trusted, can sometimes produce. She wrote what she had seen. She wrote the physician names and the dates and the clinic codes and the billing designations, and she cross-referenced them against the 47 photographs to find the places where the memory was supported by the existing record and the places where it stood alone. And she marked the distinction honestly, because an honest reconstruction that acknowledges its own limits is more useful than a confident one that doesn't. At 6:15, she heard Taejun moving in the kitchen below. She heard the specific sounds of coffee being made by someone who knew where everything was, which meant he had also not slept, or had slept briefly and poorly, and was now in the kitchen because the alternative was lying down somewhere and waiting was not something either of them were built for. She came downstairs. He poured her coffee without asking. She said, "Dennis?" He said, "He'll cooperate. He wants immunity from the suspension proceedings and a written statement from the hospital confirming he acted under duress. My attorney can facilitate the statement. The immunity is between him and whoever takes the case." She said, "Who takes the case?" He said, "That's the question I've been working on since 2 this morning." He set down his cup. "The state regulatory board is compromised. Sable has 2 board members he can reach. The local police are working the criminal complaint angle, which means Musin is in a complicated position. What we need is federal." She said, "Healthcare fraud is federal jurisdiction." "Yes, and I have," he stopped, chose his word, "a contact in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Not a close contact, not someone who owes me anything, someone who I have previously provided with accurate information on a matter unrelated to this, and who therefore has reason to believe that information I provide is worth examining." She said, "You want to call in a federal contact to present evidence that includes your own criminal exposure?" "Yes." "That contact is going to open a file on you the moment you walk in." "Yes." She looked at him. She said, You've thought about what happens to your people. He said, I've thought about it. She said, and? He was quiet for a moment. The coffee was hot and bitter, and he looked at it. He said, the people who work for me who are in the operational structure, the illegal structure, they've known for a long time that this was a possible outcome. Nobody walks into this kind of work expecting guarantees. He paused. I have people who are in legitimate operations, businesses, real estate, the restaurant. Those people are not touched by what I'm providing. I've had Raymond verify that. He looked up. The people who are in the operational structure will be informed today that a change is coming. They'll have time to make decisions. She said, you're warning them. I'm not telling them to run. I'm telling them the landscape is changing and they need to decide where they stand. She thought about whether that was adequate and decided it was the best version of inadequate available. She said, make your call. The federal contact was an assistant U.S. attorney named Sarah Brennan, and Tae-jun reached her at 7:45 and she agreed to a meeting at 9, which was either a sign of genuine urgency or a sign that she had been waiting for Tae-jun to call about something for a while, and this was the morning it happened. Amara did not ask which. She got dressed and organized her documents and rode in the car to the federal building and sat in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and coffee, and waited while Tae-jun and Raymond Chu went in first. She waited 40 minutes. When the door opened, it was Sarah Brennan who came out. Mid-40s, dark blazer, the face of someone who processed information quickly and showed you almost none of what she did with it. She looked at Amara directly and said, Ms. Belrose, I've read your nursing board file. Come in. The next 3 hours were the most precise conversation Amara had ever had. Brennan asked questions in a specific sequence that revealed she had already built a preliminary framework before anyone walked through her door, which meant she had been watching Lake Haven or Calder or both before this morning. Amara answered everything accurately, including the parts where the accuracy was uncomfortable, the access card that hadn't worked, the utility panel, the 47 photographs, the reconstruction, the precise terms of her arrangement with Tae-jun. Brennan said, you accepted protection from a known criminal organization while conducting what you're characterizing as a legitimate investigation. Amara said, yes. Brennan said, you understand how that looks. Amara said, I understand exactly how that looks. I also understand that I am a homeless nurse with no institutional affiliation, no funding, no legal standing, and approximately 1 year of evidence that a senior hospital administrator and a private investor have been running a medical fraud operation that has affected potentially hundreds of patients. I accepted the resources available to me to stay alive long enough to bring that evidence forward. I did not participate in criminal activity. I did not receive criminal proceeds. I conducted a legitimate investigation under extremely difficult conditions, and I'm sitting in this room because I believe you are the right person to do something with what I found. Brennan looked at her. She said, the photographs. Amara put her phone on the table. Brennan looked at each of the 47 photographs with the attention of someone doing triage, sorting quickly, marking what mattered, building a map. She stopped 3 times and asked questions about specific documents. Amara answered from memory, including the reconstruction, marking which elements were photographed and which were recalled. Brennan said, the 3 files you're reconstructing from memory, you're certain of the physician's signatures. Amara said, I am certain of 2 of the 3. The third I am 85% certain of, and I have told you that specifically because I am not going to tell you I'm 100% certain of something I'm not. Brennan almost smiled. She said, give me 48 hours. Amara said, Sable filed an amended criminal complaint yesterday. He has 2 contacts on the state regulatory board. 48 hours is, Brennan said, I know what 48 hours costs. I'm asking for them anyway. Amara said, then don't waste them. She went back to the restaurant and she waited, and the waiting was the hardest physical thing she had done in a year that contained a great many hard physical things. She checked on Clifford twice by phone. He had his instructions. His numbers were in range. He said, you sound tired. She said, I'm fine. He said, that's not what I said. She said, I know. I'll check in tomorrow. I was quiet for a moment and then said, okay, in the voice of someone deciding to believe something that they are not entirely sure they believe. She called Gloria Reyes and told her the timeline had shifted to federal jurisdiction, and Gloria said, Is that good or bad? And Amara said, It's both. And Gloria said, That's honest. And then said, I'm filing the regulatory complaint today regardless. Separate track. I want it in the system before anything else moves. Do it, Amara said. It was filed at 2:17 that afternoon. At 4:30, Sable's attorney called Gloria and demanded withdrawal of the filing on the basis of the pending criminal complaint. Gloria told him she would take that under advisement, and then did not take it under advisement, and instead forwarded the call recording to Sarah Brennan's office. At 6 in the evening, Tai-Jun came to the room above the restaurant and knocked and stood in the doorway and said, There's a problem. She put down her pen. He said, Sable knows about the federal meeting. I don't know how. He has someone in the building or someone who watches the parking structure. He knows Brennan is involved. He paused. He's going to move on the archive tonight. Not review. Destruction. She said, He can't destroy federal evidence once Brennan hasn't issued a preservation order yet. She said 48 hours. It's been 9. She stood up. She said, If those files are destroyed, the reconstruction and the 47 photographs hold up the pattern, but not the proof. We go from a strong case to a circumstantial one. He looked at her directly. He's staging a fire. The word sat in the room. She said, How do you know? He said, Because the man who does his building security called the man who does my building security 40 minutes ago, and my man called me. And I have been standing here trying to decide whether to tell you because I knew what you would want to do. She was already moving toward the door. He said, Amara? She stopped. He said, If you go to that hospital right now. She said, If I don't go to that hospital right now, there is no case. Everything we've done in the last 72 hours becomes a story about a nurse and a mafia boss that ends with a filing that can't be proven. He said, I know. She said, Then let's go. The convoy was 3 cars tonight. She did not comment on that. She sat in the back with Tai-Jun and her phone, texting Brennan's emergency line. Sable staging destruction of archive evidence tonight. Lake Haven 3rd floor. Move or lose it. She did not know if Brennan would respond in time. She sent it anyway. They were 6 blocks from Lake Haven when the first smoke alarm went off. She heard it through the car window before she saw anything. The specific register of a building alarm, not a car alarm, not a street sound. The alarm of an institutional building that exists to tell the people inside it that something is wrong. Then she saw the light. Not flame, not yet, but the particular color of smoke illuminated from below in a sealed space, coming from the east side of the 3rd floor in a wing she knew was adjacent to the administrative corridor. She said, He moved faster than you said. Tai-Jun said, Yes. The car stopped 2 blocks short because the street was already closing. Emergency vehicles beginning to respond, the specific choreography of a city that has protocols for burning buildings and is now executing them. She got out. She did not wait for anyone. She moved toward the hospital on foot, and Tai-Jun was beside her before she had taken 10 steps, and she did not tell him to stay back because it would have been a waste of breath. The east entrance was still open. Hospital staff were beginning a controlled evacuation. Not panic. Not yet. The trained evacuation of a facility that practices this. People in scrubs moving patients from the east wing in the specific organized way that training produces. But the 3rd floor east corridor was showing smoke at the window line, and she could see from the street that whatever had been started up there was not small. She went through the east entrance. A security guard said, Ma'am, the building is being evacuated. She said, I'm a nurse. Where are your most compromised patients? The guard's response to that was exactly what she expected. A 3-second reassessment of the situation followed by an answer, because that is what security guards do when a person in dark clothing uses clinical language with authority. At the moment a building is on fire. He said, East Wing 404 and 407, 2 patients post-surgical, limited mobility. She was already moving toward the stairwell. The 3rd floor was worse than it looked from outside. The smoke was thicker in the corridor than the alarm response would have suggested. Whoever had set this had used something accelerant adjacent, the kind of thing that produces more smoke quickly than heat, designed to compromise visibility and force evacuation before suppression, designed to give the fire time to reach paper. The archive room was 30 feet from the origin point and the door was closed, but the smoke around the door frame was the wrong color. She went up to 4. 404 was a 67-year-old woman named, according to the whiteboard outside her door, as C. Morales, post-surgical, who was awake and coughing and very frightened. Amara went in, assessed her in 15 seconds. No oxygen dependency, IV line that could be disconnected, stable enough to move, and said, "I need you to stand up for me. I've got you." The woman said, "I can't. My hip." "I know. I'm going to be right here. We're going to do this slowly. You can do this." She got the woman up. It was not graceful. The woman's weight and her hip and the IV line all complicated the process in the specific ways that moving a post-surgical patient without proper equipment complicates it, and Amara's left shoulder took most of the weight and would remind her of this for the next week. She got her to the door and into the corridor where a nurse she didn't know appeared, young, wide-eyed, and Amara said, "Take her to the stairwell. Stay with her all the way to the ground floor. Don't put her on the elevator." The young nurse took the patient. 407 was a harder situation. The patient was a man in his 50s, heavier, a different post-surgical profile that left him genuinely unable to stand without equipment she did not have. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she said, "I'm going to need help. Don't move." She went into the corridor and said loudly, "I need someone in 407 right now, non-ambulatory patient." Taejun appeared at the end of the corridor. She stared at him for exactly 1 second. She said, "Room 407, left side. Do exactly what I tell you." He did not ask questions. He came into the room and took the left side of the patient and did exactly what she told him, which was to provide the structural support that her smaller frame could not provide while she managed the IV line and guided the direction of movement and kept the patient calm enough that his muscle response did not fight them. They got him out of the room. They got him to the corridor. They got him to the stairwell, which was filling with the organized noise of an evacuation in progress, but not yet with smoke. 2 other nurses appeared on the landing and took the patient. She was turning back toward the corridor when part of the ceiling in the archive-adjacent section came down. Not a structural collapse. A panel section, tile and the framework beneath it, loosened by the heat differential in the ceiling space above the archive corridor. It came down fast and loud, and she was not directly under it, but she was close enough that the edge of it caught her left arm, and the impact was significant enough that she went to one knee on the stairwell landing and stayed there for a moment while her arm processed what had happened. Taejun was beside her before she registered that she had gone down. He said, "Don't." She said, "I'm fine." He said, "You're not fine." She said, "I can move, that's fine enough." She got up. Her left arm was wrong in a way she recognized clinically and was categorizing for later because right now the category she needed was functional, and functional was what she was. She held it against her side and kept moving. They came out through the east entrance into the cold and noise. 3 fire trucks, 2 ambulances, the specific controlled chaos of emergency response arriving to find a situation that is worse than the dispatch suggested. The street was full of people, patients in gowns, staff in scrubs, neighbors, a news van that had arrived with the speed news vans arrive when something photogenic is happening near a hospital. And police. Not the standard emergency response unit. 2 unmarked vehicles, the kind that belong to people who have been called about something specific rather than dispatched in response to an alarm. Musin was there. He was standing beside one of the unmarked vehicles looking at the building, and when he saw Amara come through the east entrance with Taejun beside her, and her left arm held against her side, he walked toward them with the expression of a man who has been doing this job long enough to recognize when a situation has moved outside his control. He said, "You need medical attention." She said, "I need to know if someone is in the archive room." He said, "The archive room is..." He stopped, looked at the building. She said, "Is someone in there?" He said, "We have a report of an individual who may have been in the administrative corridor. We haven't made contact." She said, "Everett Sable." Musin's jaw set. She said, "He staged this. He went in to destroy the files, and he either didn't get out or he's still in there finishing what he started." Musin said, "How do you know?" She said, "Because I know exactly how this man thinks, and he does not leave things half done. If the archive still has files in it, he's still in there." Musin looked at her, looked at the building, looked at Taejun beside her. He said, "We have 2 firefighters in the 3rd floor corridor right now." She said, "Then tell them the archive room is a priority. Tell them there may be an individual inside. Tell them the files in that room are material evidence in a federal investigation." She said it loudly and clearly and looked at Musin and waited. He got on his radio. She stood in the cold with her arm against her side and the noise of the emergency response around her, and the smoke coming from the third-floor east wing of a hospital she had worked in for 6 years. And she breathed, and she thought about 47 photographs uploaded to a cloud account, and a reconstruction written by hand in a room above a restaurant, and 2 patients willing to speak on record, and Dennis Cho deciding which side of this he was going to stand on, and an assistant U.S. attorney who had been given 48 hours and had so far used 9 of them. She thought about what was inside that archive room. She thought about what had already been burned and what had not. She thought about how much of a year's work the next 10 minutes was going to determine. Taejun stood beside her. He did not touch her arm. He did not tell her it would be all right. He stood in the specific way he had of standing that was not performance, not authority, not anything except the physical fact of a person who had decided where he was going to be and was being there. She looked at the third-floor window. The smoke was thinning, which meant either the fire was coming under control or the archive room was already empty of everything that mattered. She did not know which. She stood in the Chicago cold and waited for the next 10 minutes to tell her which kind of night this was going to be. And the waiting was the hardest thing she had done yet, which was a sentence she had said to herself before and kept being surprised to find was still true, because each time she reached the bottom of what she had, there was still something below it that the situation required. Inside the building, a radio crackled. Musin turned. She watched his face as he listened to whatever was coming through, and his face was the face of a man receiving information that was reorganizing what he thought he knew, and it was doing it fast. He lowered the radio. He looked at Amara. He said, "They found him. They found Everett Sable on the floor of the archive room. Not dead." That would have been a simpler story, and this was not a simple story. He was alive and conscious, and had been found by 2 firefighters near the back wall of the room, crouched low where the smoke was thinnest, his expensive suit ruined, his silver hair gray with ash, a small metal canister on the floor beside him that had been the accelerant, and that he had apparently not had time to fully deploy before the smoke from the initial burn point had turned the room into something he could not breathe through. Musin relayed this in pieces as the information came through his radio. Amara stood in the cold and listened, and did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief. What she felt was closer to the specific exhaustion that comes when you have been braced for something terrible for so long that the absence of the terrible thing does not immediately register as good news, but only as a change in the texture of the waiting. She said, "The files." Musin said, "They're pulling people out first." She said, "The files in the archive room, are they intact?" He looked at her. She said, "I need to know how much of the room burned before they got in." He got on the radio again, asked the question in the clipped language of someone who has learned to translate civilian urgency into procedural requests without losing the urgency. The answer came back in 30 seconds. He said, "Partial burn, east wall shelving. The accelerant didn't reach the section you described." She breathed. It was not a dramatic breath. It was the kind of breath a body takes when it has been operating on partial oxygen for an extended period and has just been reminded that full oxygen is an option. She took it and stood very still and let it move through her, and then she looked at Taejun, and he was looking at her, and she said nothing, and neither did he, because nothing was what the moment required. Sable was brought out through the east entrance on a gurney. He was breathing without assistance, and his eyes were open, and when they wheeled him past, he turned his head and looked at Amara. The look was not the look of defeat. It was something harder to name and harder to sit with. The look of a man who has not yet decided that he has lost, who is already calculating what this damage can be managed into, what the next move is, how a burning archive and an accelerant canister and a firefighter rescue can be shaped into a different story than the one it appears to be. She looked back. She did not say anything. There was nothing she needed to say to him. She had spent a year building something that would say it for her, and the saying was no longer her job. It was the job of the documents in the cloud account and the 47 photographs in the federal jurisdiction that Sarah Brennan's office was now exercising over a situation that had been growing in Brennan's peripheral vision long before tonight. Musin arrested Sable at the ambulance. Not aggressively, not dramatically. He simply stood at the ambulance door and told the paramedic that his patient was being detained pending further questioning and that the paramedic should proceed with medical treatment and Musin would be at the hospital when Sable was cleared for interview. The paramedic looked at the situation and did not argue, and Sable looked at Musin and said something that Amara was too far away to hear. Mohsin's expression did not change. She turned away. Her arm was sending clear messages about its condition, and she had been answering those messages with a very deliberate silence, but the silence was becoming harder to maintain. Tejan was watching her hold it against her side, and he said, "There's an EMT at the corner who's been watching you for 5 minutes." She said, "I know." He said, "Let them look at it." She said, "In a minute." He said, "Amara." It was the first time he had used her name without any other words around it, and something about the specific weight of it, just her name, just that, made her stop calculating long enough to look at him. He said, "The part that required you to hold everything together alone is finished. Let someone look at your arm." She went to the EMT. The arm was not broken. It was a significant impact injury that would swell substantially over the next 24 hours and would need imaging to rule out a hairline fracture, which the EMT told her in the careful language of someone who is not going to tell a person what to do, but is going to make sure the person understands the possible consequences of not doing it. She said she would go for imaging. She meant it. She went in the morning because the night was not finished yet. Brennan called at 11:47. She had seen the news. Chicago's local channels had the Lake Haven fire as a developing story, which meant they had the footage of the evacuation and the smoke and the emergency response, and one of them had a camera in position when Sable was wheeled out, which meant that footage existed, which meant that the story was already being assembled by people whose job was to assemble stories and who were working with less information than Amara had, but more distribution. Brennan said, "Tell me what happened tonight," Amara told her. All of it, in sequence, in the factual language she had been using for a year when describing things she needed other people to act on. Brennan listened without interrupting, which Amara had noticed was Brennan's primary professional skill and a formidable one. When she finished, Brennan said, "The canister." Amara said, "It's evidence. It needs to be in federal custody before the local chain gets complicated." Brennan said, "I've already made that call. I made it 9 minutes ago." A pause. "Ms. Belrose, the 48 hours I asked for, I'm compressing them. I need you in my office at 8 tomorrow morning with everything you have. Physical documents, the cloud account credentials, the reconstruction, all of it." Amara said, "I'll be there." Brennan said, "Bring your attorney." Amara said, "I don't have an attorney." Brennan said, "Get one tonight." She called Gloria Reyes at midnight. Gloria answered on the second ring, which suggested she had not been sleeping, and said, "I saw the news. Are you hurt?" And Amara said, "My arm. It's manageable." And Gloria said, "That's not what I asked." And Amara said, "I know. I need you at the U.S. Attorney's office at 8 tomorrow morning." Gloria was quiet for a moment and then said, "I'll be there at 7:30. She went back to the room above the restaurant. She sat at the desk for a long time without working. She sat and looked at the documents that were still spread across the desk. The documents that had survived because they were here and not in the archive. The documents that were also now in a cloud account and in Brennan's preliminary framework and in the cooperative disclosure package that Raymond Chu was still finalizing. The documents that had spent almost a year in a canvas bag pressed against her ribs. And she sat with them in the quiet and let the night decompress around her. She thought about her nursing board certificate. The frame. The apartment she no longer had. She thought about it without the particular sharpness that the thought had carried for a year and noticed that the sharpness was diminished, not because it mattered less, but because the year that had sharpened it was now different in its character. It was a year of something now, not just a year of loss. She thought about Clifford and his glucometer and the written instructions she had given him and whether his numbers were in range. She called him. It was late, and he would likely not answer, and she was not sure why she was calling except that she needed to call someone who existed entirely outside what tonight had been, someone for whom she was simply the woman in bed 14 with the canvas bag who understood what the numbers on his glucometer meant. He answered. He said, "It's midnight." She said, "I know, I'm sorry." He said, "Are you okay?" She said, "Yeah, I think so. I'm sorry for calling late." He said, "I saw something on the news about that hospital." She said, "It's okay. It's being handled." A pause. He said, "You did that thing you do, where you go handle something dangerous and then call me after to make sure I don't worry." She said, "That's not—" She stopped. "Maybe." He said, "My numbers are fine. 7-2 before dinner, 9-1 after. I wrote them down like you showed me." She said, "That's good. That's really good, Clifford." He said, "Go sleep. Whatever you handled tonight, it'll still be handled in the morning." She said, "Yeah." She did not sleep much, but she slept some, which was more than the night before. And when she woke at 6, her arm had swollen in the way the EMT had predicted, and she looked at it and thought, "Imaging this morning, after Brennan, non-negotiable." The meeting with Brennan lasted 4 hours. It was not a comfortable 4 hours. Brennan was thorough in the way that federal prosecutors are thorough, which is a different category of thorough, from the way a nurse or an investigative journalist or a regulatory attorney is thorough. It was the thoroughness of someone building something that needs to survive challenges from people whose entire professional purpose is to find the places where it doesn't hold. She went through every document, every photograph, the reconstruction, line by line, asking Amara to explain the basis of each recalled detail, separating the supported from the independent, marking both accurately. She asked about Taejun in a way that was precise and not hostile, but also not comfortable. Amara answered in a way that was equally precise and equally direct. At the end of it, Brennan looked at the full assembled record and was quiet for a long time, and Gloria Reyes sat beside Amara, with her hands folded and her face arranged in the expression of someone who has been in this kind of room before and understands that the silence after a federal prosecutor looks at your evidence is one of the more consequential silences available to a human being. Brennan said, "The archive records that weren't burned, we're taking them into federal custody today. The ones that were burned, the partial burn created a documentary record of the destruction attempt, which is itself evidence of consciousness of guilt." Gloria said, "Meaning?" Brennan said, "Meaning Everett Sable walked into that archive room last night and burned things, and the fact that he burned things tells us what was in those things. A jury understands that." She looked at Amara. "Your reconstruction is corroborated by what we know was in that room. It's not perfect. It won't be. But combined with the rest of this," she indicated the assembled record, "it holds." Amara said, "And the criminal complaint he filed against me." Brennan said, "Is being reviewed by my office in the context of everything else we now have, which includes a statement from Kang Tae-jun's attorney describing the terms of the arrangement and confirming your independence of operation." She paused. "It's not going to disappear overnight. These things don't, but the trajectory is clear." Amara said, "I need my nursing license back." Brennan said, "The board proceeding is separate from my jurisdiction." Amara said, "I know. But the board proceeding was initiated on the basis of fabricated evidence and a complaint filed by people who are now federal targets. I need that on record." Brennan said, "It'll be on record." Gloria leaned forward and said, "I've already filed a motion with the state board to stay the proceeding pending the federal investigation. If this office confirms it's investigating Sable and Calder for fraud, which I assume it is, the stay will likely be granted." Brennan said, "I can confirm that." Gloria looked at Amara. Amara looked at the table. She had spent a year imagining this moment, and the imagined version had always been cleaner. A single point of resolution, a door opening, a clear before and after. The real version was more like a sequence of small bureaucratic acknowledgments, accumulating into something that would eventually, when she looked back, constitute justice. It was less satisfying and more real, and she was surprised to find that she could hold both of those things at the same time. She went for imaging after the meeting. The arm was a hairline fracture of the radius, non-displaced, which the radiologist described as something that would heal with proper immobilization and time and that did not require surgery. She sat in the imaging center with a temporary splint and thought about the specific irony of a nurse who had managed a post-surgical patient with a compromised hip through a smoke-filled corridor without proper equipment and had fractured her own arm in the process, and had then conducted a 4-hour federal meeting before going to get it looked at. Taejun was in the waiting area when she came out. She stopped. He said, "Raymond told me where you'd be." She said, "Raymond shouldn't have." He said, "Probably not." He looked at the splint. "How bad?" She said, 6 weeks. Maybe 8. He nodded. She sat down in the chair beside him because standing was becoming a negotiation between her arm and the rest of her body that she didn't have the energy to win. They sat in the imaging center waiting room in the specific quiet of two people who have been through something large together and are now in the first moments of what comes after, which is always stranger and quieter than the thing itself. She said, "What happens to you now?" He said, "Raymond and Brennan's office are working out the parameters of the cooperation agreement. It'll take time. It'll be complicated." He paused. "Some of what I've run is going to see daylight. I've known that since the precinct steps." She said, "Your people." He said, "I spoke to the operational staff yesterday afternoon. I told them the landscape was changing and what that meant. Some of them will have decisions to make. That's on them." He looked at the middle distance. The legitimate operations, the restaurant, the real estate holdings, the investment fund, those stand. Raymond's been working to keep them clear of the criminal exposure. It's possible, not certain. She said, "Your niece." Something shifted in his face. She said, "Does she know what her uncle does?" He said, "She knows enough, more than I would have chosen for her to know, less than the full picture." He stopped. "She's been at university for a year, biology. She calls me on Sundays." Amara said, "Keep that." He said, "I intend to." She looked at her splinted arm. She thought about the photograph she did not have, the moment in the archive room when she had read those 3 files and understood completely the structure of what Sable and Calder had built, and the specific, deliberate cruelty of using the bodies and records of sick people as the raw material of a financial scheme. She did not have the photograph. She had the memory. She would always have the memory. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly." He said, "Yes." She said, "That morning outside the hospital, you came because of your niece, because you'd been looking for me for 3 years, but you also came because you had your own reasons to want Calder and Sable exposed. Your man's records had been used. Your organization had been operated on without consent." She looked at him. "Which one was the reason?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Both." She said, "Which one came first?" He said, "My niece." He said it without hesitation, and the lack of hesitation was the only part of the answer she was actually listening for. "When I found out you were at that shelter, when Denise's call came to my contact, I wasn't thinking about Calder. I was thinking about a nurse who had spoken to a terrified 17-year-old in a voice that made the fear aloud, and who had lost everything for doing her job the right way. That came first." He paused. "The rest came when I understood what you had found." She sat with that. She said, "Okay?" He said, "Okay?" She said, "Okay." That's the answer I needed. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had been trying to categorize since the morning outside the hospital, the one that was not calculation and not performance, and was something she was only beginning to have language for. He said, "What do you do now?" She had been thinking about this since the morning with Brennan, not in the abstract way she had been thinking about it for a year. The version where clearing her name was the endpoint, and what came after was a vague resumption of the life she'd had. She had been thinking about it specifically, concretely, the way she thought about things when she needed the thinking to produce something actionable. She said, "There's a neighborhood on the south side, Englewood. 4 years ago, before everything happened, I volunteered twice a month at a free clinic there that lost its funding. They closed." She looked at her hand. "The building is still there. I checked 6 days ago. It's been sitting empty." He said, "You want to reopen it?" She said, "I want to build something. Not reopen, rebuild. Something that doesn't depend on the funding cycles that closed the first one. A community trauma clinic, not a charity operation. A staffed, funded facility that functions like any clinic, except that no one gets turned away because they can't pay." She stopped. "I know how to treat people. I know the specific population in that area and what they need and what the gaps are in the existing system. I have been watching those gaps for 6 years and studying them involuntarily for the last one." He said, "That requires capital." She said, "I know." He said, "I have legitimate assets." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I'm not offering it as leverage. I want to be clear about that." She said, "I know you're not. I wouldn't take it if you were." He said, "Then what are you saying?" She said, "I'm saying I know what I'm going to build. I'm saying I know what it requires. I'm saying I'll talk to you about it when my license is back in my hand and not before." She looked at him. "Because that's the right order." He said, "That's a reasonable order." She said, "Yes." She left the imaging center and went back to the room above the restaurant and slept for 11 hours, which was more consecutive sleep than she had had in almost a year. And when she woke, the room was dark and her arm ached cleanly inside its splint, and the canvas bag was on the floor beside the desk where she had left it. Lighter now, much lighter, the bulk of its contents having moved into federal custody and cloud accounts, and a filing with the state regulatory board, and the cooperative disclosure documents that were currently sitting on Raymond Chu's desk being finalized. She looked at the bag. She had carried it for a year like it was her organs, like it contained the proof of her continued existence. It was just canvas now, old and flattened and smelling like a year of difficult rooms. She kept it. The next 6 weeks were the kind of weeks that do not make good story. They were procedural and slow and full of the specific bureaucratic endurance that justice, when it comes, actually requires. The federal investigation expanded quickly once Brennan's office had the full record, pulling in the financial structures that connected Calder's clinic network to the billing fraud in a way that made the scope visible for the first time to people with the authority to act on it. 3 of Calder's clinic directors were served with grand jury subpoenas within the first 2 weeks. The fourth, a man named Hollister, who had been running the largest of the billing operations, entered into a proffer agreement that opened a secondary financial channel that even Amara's documents had not reached. Marissa Calder was arrested on a Tuesday morning in a federal operation that she later described to her attorney as excessive, which was the kind of thing a person says when the alternative is acknowledging that the operation was exactly proportionate to what she had done. She was charged with healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea and began the process of arguing that the evidence was tainted by its origins, and Brennan's office spent the better part of 3 weeks demonstrating, document by document, the independence of each evidentiary line. Sable was charged separately, additional charges on top of the fraud, relating specifically to the events in the archive room. The accelerant canister and the access logs and the timing relative to the federal investigation constituted obstruction that added significant weight to the existing fraud charges. His attorney negotiated aggressively. He did not negotiate successfully. Dennis Cho cooperated fully and received a negotiated outcome that allowed him to avoid criminal charges in exchange for his testimony and the access logs. He left Lake Haven's employment as part of the agreement, and as far as Amara knew, moved to a cousin's house in Indianapolis and was trying to decide what to do next. She thought about him sometimes with a specific complicated feeling that was not quite sympathy and not quite judgment, and was probably the honest response to someone who had been in a difficult position and made partially bad decisions and partially good ones. Patricia Voss resigned from Lake Haven 2 weeks after the federal charges were filed. No statement, no explanation made public. Her resignation was reported in a brief item in the Tribune's business section that was 14 lines long and did not mention Amara's name. Amara noticed. She noticed and thought, 14 lines and no mention. And then she moved on to the next thing, because the next thing was always waiting and always would be. The state nursing board voted on her license reinstatement on a Thursday morning in March, 6 weeks after the federal charges and 8 weeks after the night of the archive fire. She was present for the vote, sitting in the third row of the boardroom in a dark blazer over a blouse she had purchased 2 weeks earlier. Not because she needed the right clothes to deserve the outcome, but because she had decided she wanted to sit in that room in something she had chosen for the occasion, something that was hers. Gloria Reyes sat beside her. The vote was 4-1 in favor of reinstatement. The one dissenting vote was from a board member whose connection to Dr. Sable had been subsequently flagged for its own review, which Amara noted but did not celebrate, because celebrating other people's accountability felt like the wrong use of energy. The board chair read the resolution aloud. Amara sat and listened to the language of institutional restitution. The acknowledgement that the original complaint had been filed on the basis of fabricated evidence, that the suspension had been unjust, that her record would be corrected and her license restored in full. She listened to it and did not cry and did not perform composure and simply sat with it moving through her the way true things move through a person when they finally arrive. Not like an explosion, but like something settling into a place it had always been meant to occupy. Gloria squeezed her hand once and let it go. After the vote, in the hallway outside the boardroom, Amara stood for a moment alone, not waiting for anyone, just standing, looking at the window at the end of the hall where Chicago was visible in the thin March light, gray-brown and real and specific, the city she had not left. She had not left. That still meant something to her. She took out her phone and called Clifford. He answered on the third ring. She could hear the television in the background, a game show, something with an audience. She said, "My license is back." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Well." She said, "Yeah." "Yeah," he said. "Your numbers any good today?" She laughed. It was not a big laugh. It was the small, surprised kind that comes when something finds you before you've prepared for it. But it was real. She said, "I haven't checked today." He said, "Probably fine. You're a nurse again. Nurses are supposed to have good numbers." She said, "That's not how that works." He said, "Don't explain it to me. I'm celebrating." She said, "I'll come see you this week." He said, "Bring that thing you showed me with the soup from the restaurant." She said, That's a specific dish. I can't just." She stopped. "I'll try." He made a satisfied sound and the game show continued in the background, and she stood in the hallway of the nursing board building with her phone and her license reinstated, and the specific warmth of a person who celebrates in the currency of soup. She went to see the building in Englewood that afternoon. It was the kind of building that announces exactly what it has been through. 2 stories, brick, a former clinic that had functioned for 11 years before the funding ran out, and the doors closed and the neighborhood resumed managing its own health with the same resourcefulness and inadequate tools it had always had. The windows were intact, boarded, but intact. The parking area needed work. The interior, when she walked through with the building manager, was gutted down to the original structure, which was sound. She walked through every room. She stood in what had been the main treatment area and looked at the window that faced the street and thought about the population she had served as a volunteer and what their needs had been and what the gaps were and how a facility built around those gaps specifically would need to be designed to actually close them rather than approximate closure. She thought about it as a clinical problem because that was how she thought about things she intended to solve. She called Tai-jun from the parking lot. He answered immediately. She said, "The building in Englewood. I'm standing in the parking lot." He said, "How is it?" She said, "Sound. Needs significant renovation. The treatment area layout will need to be redesigned from scratch." She paused. "I'm ready to have the conversation." A pause on his end. He said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He was there in 17. The black sedan, not a convoy, just the one car, pulled into the parking lot, and he got out and stood beside her and looked at the building. He looked at it the way she had learned he looked at things he was assessing. Quiet, methodical, not performing impressiveness or disappointment, but simply looking. He said, "What do you need?" She had a list. She had been building it for 2 weeks in the margins of the documents that were no longer evidence of anything except her own planning. She went through it without apology and without softening. Renovation costs, equipment, staffing, the specific funding structure she was proposing that would make the facility not dependent on a single donor or a single funding cycle. The partnership she had been discussing with 2 community health organizations already operating in the area. The sliding scale payment model that would allow the clinic to sustain itself at partial capacity even in difficult funding years. He listened to all of it. He asked 4 questions, all of them financial and precise. She answered 3 of them directly and told him she needed another week to work out the answer to the 4th. He said, "I can fund the initial renovation and the first 18 months of operating costs. After that, I want the funding structure you've described to be carrying the weight." He looked at her. "I don't want this to be mine. I want this to be yours." She said, "It will be mine. The funding source doesn't determine ownership of a thing. The work does." He said, "Yes." She said, "I need it in writing. The terms, the governance structure, the decision-making authority, everything." He said, "Raymond will have a draft by end of week." She said, "I'll have Gloria review it." He said, "Of course." They stood in the Englewood parking lot in the March cold, the 2 of them, looking at a building that was going to require a significant amount of difficult work before it became the thing she intended it to become. And the silence between them was the comfortable silence of people who have been through something together and have arrived at a place that is not the end of anything, but is unmistakably the beginning of something else. She said, "Your niece." He said, "She called Sunday." She said, "Does she know what's been happening?" He said, "She knows I've been cooperating with federal investigators. She knows the organization is being wound down. She knows it's complicated." He stopped. She asked me if I was okay. I told her I was more okay than I had been in a long time, which is true, and also not an easy thing to say. Amara said, "What did she say to that?" He said, She said she was glad, and then she told me about a professor who had spoken to her class about community medicine and the specific needs of underserved populations, and she talked about it for 20 minutes without stopping. He paused. She's going to be a doctor. Amara said, yes, she is. He looked at this building. He said, she'd like to meet you someday, if that's something you'd be open to. Amara looked at the building too. She thought about a trauma bay 3 years ago and a frightened 17-year-old and the specific decision to let the fear be allowed instead of managed. She thought about how that decision had led, in the long and non-linear way that decisions lead to things, to a parking lot in Englewood in March, and a building that was about to become something it had not been before. She said, when she's ready, not as a story, as a person. He said she'd want it that way too. The renovation took 4 months. Amara was present for most of it, not managing the construction, which was outside her expertise, but present in the way she had learned to be present for things that mattered, consistently, quietly, doing whatever the situation required each day without waiting for someone else to determine what that was. She worked with the 2 community health organizations to design the intake process and the triage protocols and the staffing structure. She recruited 3 nurses from contacts she had maintained through the shelter network and 2 physicians who had heard about the project through channels she had not anticipated and had called her directly. One of the calls had come from Dr. Claudia Marsh, her former mentor, the one who had not answered her phone the night Amara's badge was deactivated. Amara had let the call go to voicemail. She had listened to the voicemail 3 times. Claudia's voice was careful and genuine and carried the specific weight of someone who had been living with a decision for a year and had decided to address it, even though addressing it was going to be uncomfortable. She said she had followed what had happened. She said she was sorry she had not answered that night. She said she understood if Amara didn't want to talk. She said she was a good physician and she would work for reduced compensation if the clinic needed her, and she would understand a no. Amara called her back. It was not a warm conversation, and it was not a cold one. It was the kind of conversation that is honest about what it is, which is 2 people navigating damage that was real without pretending the damage didn't happen. Amara told Claudia what it had meant to call that night and receive silence. She told it without anger. She had processed the anger in the year of nights above a restaurant, and in the shelter, and in the parking garage before that. But she told it completely, because incomplete accountability was not accountability. Claudia listened, did not make excuses, said, "You're right, I was afraid and I let my fear be more important than you." Amara said, "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. Amara said, "I'll think about the position. Don't contact me again before I do." She thought about it for 2 weeks and then called Claudia and offered her a part-time position that would be evaluated at 6 months. Claudia accepted without negotiating the terms, which was the right decision. The Belrose Community Trauma Clinic opened on a Tuesday morning in late July, which was not a photogenic day, overcast, humid, the particular kind of Chicago summer morning that makes everyone slightly irritable before 9 o'clock. There was no ribbon cutting. Amara had specifically and repeatedly declined the ribbon-cutting suggestions from the community organizations, not because she was modest about it, but because a ribbon cutting is about the beginning, and what she was interested in was everything after the beginning. They opened the doors. The first patient arrived at 8:47, 11 minutes before the official start of clinic hours, which was a detail Amara found clarifying. The need had not waited for the official start of clinic hours. It had arrived when it arrived, as it always had, as it always would. She was in the treatment room when the patient was brought in. An elderly man, 68, chest pain that had been present for 2 days, and that he had been managing at home because he did not have insurance and had not wanted to go to an emergency room and have the bill follow him for 3 years. She assessed him with the focused, efficient attention of someone who had been doing this for 6 years and 1 year of everything else. And she read the situation correctly, and she acted on it correctly, and the man was stable and being transferred to Lake Haven, a different version of Lake Haven, under new administrative leadership following the federal proceedings, within 40 minutes. She stood in the doorway of the treatment room after they left and looked at the space. The space was imperfect. The lighting in the left corner was wrong. A supply delay had meant the original fixture hadn't been replaced, and the substitute was too yellow. The intake desk was 6 inches shorter than she had specified and would need to be replaced within the year. The parking situation was not what it needed to be for elderly patients. She made a note of each thing. She went back to work. 3 months after the clinic opened, two former Lake Haven employees appeared in the intake line on different days. She did not recognize the first one until he was already inside. He was one of the techs who had been standing near the emergency bay the morning Patricia Voss had told security to remove her. He sat in the waiting area and looked at the floor, and when his name was called, he looked up and saw Amara across the room, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has carried something for a long time and does not know how to put it down. She did not perform forgiveness. She did not perform coldness. She walked to the intake desk and looked at his form and said, "What brought you in today?" He told her. It was a genuine medical issue, a recurring infection that he had been treating intermittently without resolution. She referred him to one of the clinic's physicians, and that was what the encounter was. He stopped at the desk on his way out. He said, "I should have said something that morning." She looked at him. She said, "Yeah, you should have." She paused. "Come back next week if the infection isn't improving." He left. She thought about what she had said and decided it was accurate and complete and did not require addition. The second former Lake Haven employee was a nurse, not someone who had laughed, someone who had been present, who had looked at the floor in the specific way of a person who disagrees with what is happening and has decided that disagreement is too costly to express. She was young, 3 years out of nursing school, and she sat in Amara's office and said, "I've been trying to find a place to work where I don't have to look at the floor when something wrong is happening." Amara looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Tell me about your clinical experience." The nurse told her. It was a good record, genuine competence, the kind that doesn't require decoration. Amara said, "I have one question before anything else." The nurse said, "Okay." Amara said, "Can you treat someone with dignity before you know what they can give you?" The nurse looked at her steadily. She said, "Yes." Amara said, "Come back Friday. We'll do a working interview." On the clinic's first anniversary, the day was better than the opening, cool and clear, the particular quality of late July light that Chicago produces rarely, and that, when it comes, makes the city look like it was always capable of being this. Amara arrived at 7:15, an hour before the clinic opened. She walked through each room in the quiet before the day started, checking, noting, carrying in her head the running list of what needed attention and what was working and what had been learned in a year of being open that the planning process had not anticipated. The lighting in the left corner had been fixed in October. The intake desk had been replaced in December. The parking situation was still imperfect and was probably going to remain so. She stood in the main treatment room for a moment. She thought about a canvas bag. She thought about borrowed scrubs and a coat placed around her shoulders in the cold. She thought about Clifford's glucometer and a waterproof folder with Gloria Reyes' number on the outside and a strip of paper taped to the inside of her wrist. She thought about 47 photographs and a hairline fracture and an archive room that had partially burned and a Thursday morning vote that was 4-1. She thought about the man who had died 4 minutes too late, whose name she still remembered. She stood in the quiet of the thing she had built and let it be real. She heard a car on the street, not a convoy, not an escort formation. One car, a black sedan that she recognized by now, the way you recognize the particular sound of a specific person's footsteps, not from the sound itself, but from everything that comes with the sound. She went to the window. I was standing on the sidewalk below, looking up at the clinic's front, holding 2 coffees in the specific way he held things, carefully, without making a production of the care. He was not in a suit. He was wearing a jacket over an ordinary shirt, the clothing of a man who had been doing the ordinary work of his mornings and had stopped on his way. She went downstairs and opened the door. He offered her one of the coffees. She took it. They stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, looking at the street, at the Englewood morning coming in around them, at the Chicago that had always been this complicated and difficult and specific and was still here. She said, "How's Raymond?" He said, "The cooperation agreement is finalized. He says 3 to 5 years before my legitimate holdings are fully cleared of any association with the prior operations. He says probably is still the honest word." She said, "How are you with probably?" He said, "I'm learning to be better with probably." She said, "Your niece called me." He looked at her. She said, "Last week. She got my number from someone. I don't know who." She paused. She wanted to talk about what it was like to work in an underserved clinic. Specifically, the case mix, the funding model, the intake challenges. She talked for 40 minutes without stopping. He looked at the street. He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I told her to come visit when her semester ends, that she could spend a week and see the actual work." She paused. "I told her we could use the help." He said, "She'll take you up on that." She said, "I know." They stood for a moment longer. She said, "Come in." He followed her through the door of the clinic, into the morning before it opened, into the rooms she had rebuilt from the ground of what had been taken from her. And behind them the black sedan sat at the curb without